What would you choose, the comfort of a paycheck or the breath of a child? In July 2025, under the scorched breath of the Sahel, a silence fell over the streets of Burkina Faso. It wasn't the silence of peace. It was the silence that follows a storm that came not from bullets or protests, but from a pen. With a single signature, President Ibrahim Traoré did what no other West African leader had dared. He banned all non-biodegradable plastic. No warning, no half measures, just a line of ink and the end of a toxic era. Factories closed, jobs vanished, critics howled. But the air changed. For the first time in a generation, the wind in Ouagadougou didn't carry the stench of burning waste. It smelled like rain. This was not just legislation. It was an exorcism, a cleansing of what had been considered normal for far too long. Plastic had wrapped everything: our food, our hands, our dignity. Traoré refused to let it wrap the future. He did not wait for UN approval. He did not wait for Western aid. He listened not to lobbyists, but to the mothers coughing behind market stalls. He banned plastic not to impress the world, but to protect a people the world had forgotten. If you were raised by someone who made something out of nothing, this story is for you. If you believe that clean air is not a luxury but a right, share this video. If you believe the earth remembers how we treat it, subscribe. Because this story isn't about plastic. It's about choosing dignity over convenience. And for the first time in a long time, a nation chose to breathe. There was no parade, no public announcement, no row of microphones waiting to catch a speech, just a desk, a decree, and a man who had seen too many gutters overflow with poison. On a quiet day in July 2025, President Ibrahim Traoré signed a sweeping national ban on all non-biodegradable plastic in Burkina Faso. No exemptions, no delay, no room for excuses. With one stroke of his pen, plastic bags, wrappers, and packaging things that had wrapped food bodies and dreams for decades were now illegal. And by nightfall, over 200 factories and shops across the country had gone silent. The headlines came quickly. 10,000 jobs lost in a single day. Burkina Faso bans plastic at what cost? An act of courage or chaos. But what the headlines missed was the air. For the first time in decades, the wind in Ouagadougou smelled like earth, not ash. The gutters no longer frothed with filth. The breeze didn't carry the acrid sting of smoldering trash. It carried something older, something cleaner. Rain. Traoré knew exactly what he was doing, and he knew the price. He said it plainly: I would rather lose money than lose my people. But for many, the loss was personal and painful. In Koudougou and Bobo Dioulasso, workers arrived at dawn to find gates locked. Some stood outside holding lunch tins as if waiting for a shift that would never come. Others stared in disbelief at machines that had once sung a daily rhythm, now cold and still. One manager whispered, "We thought it was just talk. Laws here. They don't really mean anything, do they?" But this time was different. The law came not from foreign consultants, not from distant ministries, but from a man who had walked barefoot through the very markets he was now trying to protect. A man who had seen children coughing behind food stalls, their breath stolen by burning plastic. Business owners were warned months in advance. They had been offered ecological transition grants, retraining programs, even machinery subsidies through the National Green Fund. But many chose to wait, betting that enforcement would be weak, that the system would bend, that Traoré, like others before him, would eventually blink. He didn't. And so the gates closed. Not with a bang, but a sigh, the sound of metal realizing it might never be touched again. At a crowded corner in Ouagadougou, an older woman stood surrounded by roasted corn, a tattered umbrella, and her last bundle of plastic bags. Her name was Fanta, 63 years old, 3 grandchildren, no pension. She had sold corn on that corner for 28 years. When the police arrived to enforce the ban, she didn't argue. She simply held out the bundle and asked, "Then tell me, what do I feed them with now, my fingers?" No one answered, because no one had answered her for 30 years. For millions like Fanta, plastic wasn't pollution, it was survival. It kept food dry. It held items together. It covered what dignity couldn't. The ban, no matter how noble, didn't feel like policy. It felt like thunder, but thunder clears the sky. The real resistance to the plastic ban didn't come from corporations. It came from the poor, not because they wanted to destroy the land, but because they had never been offered an alternative. No one had handed them starch-based wrappers or cloth bags. No one had asked how a mother with no refrigerator keeps her mangoes from spoiling without a plastic wrap. And yet this is where change had to begin, in the streets, in the markets, with people like Fanta. Because if reform does not touch the hands that carry the nation, it is not reform. It is punishment. Traore knew this, and he didn't just sign a ban. He set in motion an ecosystem of response, one that would rise not from boardrooms, but from banana leaves, recycled cloth, and ancestral knowledge. But at this stage, in the raw days after the ban, the pain was still sharper than the hope. And while smoke stopped rising from factory chimneys, a deeper question rose in its place. Was this a nation falling apart or finally coming clean? In the days following the ban, Burkina Faso felt like a nation on the brink, not of collapse but of confrontation. Markets trembled with uncertainty. Mothers clutched old bags like they were heirlooms. Elders whispered about the good intentions of young presidents and the dangers of rushing too fast. From alleyways in Bobo Dioulasso to the bustling stalls of Ouagadougou, a question echoed: how do we eat now? How do we survive? It was in this moment, this tension between despair and dignity, that something remarkable began to stir. And it didn't come from ministers or economists, it came from students. One morning, just days after the ban was enforced, a group of university students walked into the neighborhood of Fanal, not with cameras, not with press badges, but with bundles of banana fibers, palm leaves, old cloth, and quiet determination. They came to Fanta, the woman with the corn, the woman who had surrendered her last plastic bag, and they didn't offer pity, they offered possibility. They sat beside her on crates and overturned buckets and said, "Let us show you what our grandmothers used." With gentle hands, they folded, wrapped, and tied. They wove leaves the way ancestors once wrapped herbs, the way women once protected food in cloth before factories ever existed. And Fanta, who had never set foot in a university, learned. She learned how to shape palm into cones, how to tie knots without tearing, how to reimagine something she had once called trash into tools. And then she began to teach. What began as a trembling hush became a rhythm. Fanta showed other vendors. Vendors showed their neighbors. By the end of the week, a corner of panic had turned into a patch of resilience. Not just adaptation, but artistry. The marketplace didn't just survive. It changed. People began to arrive not to protest, but to learn. Women traded wrapping techniques the way others trade recipes. Some brought scraps of cloth passed down from their mothers. Others found joy in folding recycled newspaper into food holders. The smell of roasted corn returned, and so did the dignity. But perhaps the most profound shift happened far from the center, outside the landfill of Fangorma, where a child named Madu lived. Madu was 9. His mother had died of asthma in a metal shack less than 100 meters from the dump. For years, the landfill was his provider. He sorted through the discarded black bags for resale blue ones, for wrapping yellow ones for trading. The green ones he knew to stay away, they stung his eyes and burned his skin. When the truck stopped coming after the ban, Madu didn't celebrate. He froze. 3 days. Same pile. No bags, no trade, no hope. That's when a woman from the government's new Green Transition Initiative found him. She knelt down and asked gently, "Why are you still here?" Madu looked up and whispered, "Because this was the only thing that knew my name." She took his hand. At the new pilot school, there were 10 students, all children who once lived beside burning waste. They weren't taught grammar first. They were taught to compost, to mold cassava fiber, to build biodegradable packaging with their own hands. When Madu touched cassava pulp for the first time, it didn't burn. It didn't reek of oil. It held, and something inside him held too. 6 months later, his name appeared printed proudly on a prototype biodegradable bag now used in 6 open-air markets across the country. His design simple, strong, and born of experience. A child once buried in trash was now helping lead a nation out of it. But the fear never disappeared. It simply softened. Because real change does not sweep away fear. It walks beside it step by step. People like Fanta and Madu and the students of Fanal weren't naive. They knew hardship would come again. They knew the world might forget them once more. But they also knew they weren't alone this time. They had each other. And they had a vision. The plastic that once defined survival had now become a symbol of silence. And in its place, the voices of women, of youth, of the forgotten began to rise, not with shouting, with weaving, with folding, with building. The fire of resistance had not gone out. It had changed fuel, and in the hands of the humble it began to burn clean. When the plastic disappeared, so did more than just pollution. At first, what vanished was stability, familiar routines, the predictability of wrapping food in something that wouldn't tear in the rain. But soon after, something else returned, something many had forgotten how to feel. Trust? Not in institutions, not in promises, but in the land. In the weeks after the ban, rainfall returned to the Sahel not as a storm, but as a slow and steady presence. It wasn't the skies that had been absent. It was the soil that had stopped drinking. Plastic had clogged the land like cholesterol in an artery. It had buried drainage canals, strangled rice paddies, and turned each flood into a health crisis. But now, as farmers cleared the debris, not with tractors, but with hands and reverence, they began to see signs. Sprouts where none had grown for years, birds returning to forage, insects buzzing not as pests, but as part of a balance long forgotten. In the village of Zanera, an old man named Salif fell to his knees before a tiny green shoot. He wept not because it was rare, but because it was alone. For the first time in 15 years, the ground was not fighting back. A farmer does not cry easily, but when he does, something sacred has shifted. Before the ban, the word security in Burkina Faso meant one thing: soldiers on patrol. But Traoré's plastic decree revealed something deeper. What good is a soldier if the water makes your child sick? What use is a checkpoint if your crops drown in plastic-choked fields? Suddenly, local mayors began redirecting municipal funds not just to roads and fences, but to waste removal, composting programs, and local packaging cooperatives. Sanitation workers, once invisible, were now called guardians of the Republic in public briefings. The president himself visited community cleanup days not for photos, but to sweep, to listen, to kneel beside clogged gutters and ask why we let them die. Politics began to smell like soap and rainwater. Not every industry adapted. Despite months of notice, dozens of plastic manufacturing plants shut down entirely. They had been warned, offered grants, given time. But they had assumed, as many elites do, that power would hesitate when jobs were at stake. They were wrong. In Wahiguya, a once thriving industrial zone now stood quiet. The air was no longer thick with smoke. The machines didn't hum. The payroll offices had dust on their windows. To some, it was a scene of collapse, but to others, it was cleansing. Because Traoré's government didn't just shut the door on pollution. They opened another to local innovation. In villages and outer districts, new cooperatives began forming. Former factory workers retrained in cassava fiber molding. Young engineers drafted new designs for biodegradable wrapping. Women's collectives started weaving from recycled cloth and native plants. And it was not charity. These ventures were profitable. Within 6 months, Burkina Faso was supplying eco-friendly packaging to neighboring countries. What once filled dumps now filled trade trucks. Jobs lost were slowly replaced, not in number yet, but in meaning. The government labeled this movement eco-sovereignty, not just environmental reform, but industrial rebirth from within. The ban also changed how power operated. Where once big decisions were made behind tinted windows, now they were made in open-air forums. Traoré insisted that all environmental policy meetings be held in public spaces, markets, schools, farms. The message was clear: if the decision affects the ground, it must begin on the ground. This political shift didn't come with applause. It came with resistance from business lobbies, foreign investors, and even some within his own administration. But something stronger than profit was now guiding policy memory. Burkina Faso remembered what it had lost and what it had allowed, and it was no longer willing to call poison development. Perhaps the most powerful consequence of the ban was not visible. It was cultural. In schools, children were asked to draw their neighborhoods. Where once they might have sketched smokestacks and street litter, now they drew clouds, gardens, water that flowed instead of flooded, food wrapped in cloth not because of nostalgia, but because of pride. In homes, grandmothers taught granddaughters how to fold palm leaves. In churches and mosques, sermons referenced not just sin, but soil. And on national radio, callers referred to the ban not as law, but as liberation. Liberation from the things we thought we needed, but never did. Liberation from being told to wait for help, for reform, for dignity. And so the question changed. No longer can we survive without plastic. But why did we ever think we couldn't? The world did not know how to react at first. Some headlines scoffed, "Burkina Faso chooses poverty over progress." Others were cautiously curious. Could Africa lead the green movement? But when the air cleared literally and figuratively, something shifted. International media that once dismissed West African reform as symbolic began to send reporters not to cover a crisis, but to witness clarity. No one expected a landlocked, often overlooked nation to ignite the most radical environmental action in modern African history. But that's exactly what happened. In Harlem barbershops, the story of Ibrahim Traoré was passed along like a parable. Elders nodded in quiet agreement. He banned plastic just like that. In Atlanta churches, Sunday sermons included references to cleansing the land and leadership without permission. Pastors spoke not just of grace, but of ground and the need to protect it. In Caribbean classrooms, teachers paused their curriculum to tell the story of a president who didn't wait for carbon credits from Brussels or grants from Paris to do the right thing. And for many African Americans watching from afar, it wasn't just policy, it was recognition. Recognition that real leadership sometimes looks like sacrifice without applause. That the most meaningful revolutions don't always come with tanks or headlines, but with mothers wrapping food in cloth instead of plastic and children learning how to compost instead of survive in waste. Burkina Faso's decision struck an uncomfortable chord in Western capitals. Why? Because while richer nations debate incremental steps and feasibility studies, here was a country that simply acted without waiting. No summit, no donor conference, no celebrity endorsement, just a man, a pen, and a nation's willingness to endure discomfort in the name of healing. In Washington, some analysts called it reckless, but others called it a moral provocation. Because what excuse does a trillion-dollar economy have when a country fighting terrorism and drought can choose the environment over ease? For the world, especially the West Burkina Faso's ban was not just a domestic policy. It was a challenge. To stop pretending we cannot act without permission. To stop measuring success by GDP while ignoring poisoned rivers and choked cities. To listen when a country refuses comfort in favor of collective memory. And for African Americans, Afro-Caribbeans, and every diaspora descendant watching Traoré's Burkina Faso became more than a country. It became a reminder of what leadership can still mean. No bullets, no blood, only roots. That's what this war left behind. Roots of cassava. Roots of courage, roots of a nation that finally chose not just to survive, but to heal. Burkina Faso did not ban plastic to impress headlines. It did so to remember the smell of clean rain, the sound of unclogged gutters, the dignity of feeding your child without poisoning your land. But healing is fragile, and memory fades if not guarded. The return of the rain was a beginning, but not everyone returned with it. Factories still lie silent, some communities still struggle. And global systems still pressure nations to put profit before people, which is why this story matters not just to Africa, but to all of us. Because we live in a world wrapped in plastic physically, economically, and spiritually. We are told to wait for approvals for experts for solutions from somewhere else. But Burkina Faso stopped waiting. And maybe we should too. In one home, a little girl asked her grandmother, "Why no plastic today?" The grandmother smiled and answered, "Because we no longer bury our food in what once buried us." That sentence carries more weight than any press release. It's not about plastic. It's about what we're willing to stop accepting as normal. If this story moved you not just in your mind, but in your chest, then let it grow. Comment below, "I choose dignity." Share this video with someone who still believes healing is slow or impossible. Subscribe if you believe Africa's stories deserve more than silence. Because one day your child or grandchild may ask, when the land was choking, what did you choose? Let the answer be this: I chose to witness. I chose to rise.